Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to take our first deep dive look at Dark World, specifically Dark World that could have been played at the 2012 US Nationals. So when I think about summer 2012, to me, that is the Dino-Rabbit, Inzektor, Wind-Up, Chaos Dragon, maybe Hero Beat format. One of the decks that was sort of on the periphery was, in fact, Dark World. Technically, Dark World won YCS Long Beach in the beginning of the March 2012 format. Trust me, I was there. I lost to it in the top 4. However, as the format progressed, Dark World kind of went off to the side, and those 4 or 5 decks that I just mentioned a moment ago competed for that top slot. But I still think Dark World is a deck that's worth profiling because it's a particularly unique deck that attacks on an axis that not a lot of decks at the time attacked. To go back in history a little bit to put Dark World into context, Dark World existed in Elemental Energy with the original Gold, Silver, Brow. It eventually got a little bit of a boost with Dark World Dealings with Strike of Neos. But the Dark World deck that we're going to look at was popularized around YCS Columbus 2011 with the release of the Dark World Structure deck, which brought Snow, Grapha, and Gates of the Dark World. At YCS Columbus, Dark World fell short of expectations. A lot of players went into that event considering Dark World Tier 1, right off the bat from a Structure deck, Tier 1, similar to Agents and Machina and some of the other strategies that had been released within the last couple of years. Unfortunately for Dark World players, though, that was not the case at YCS Columbus. 0 appeared in the top 32. It wasn't until Kansas City, the YCS that followed, that Dark World actually started to find itself in the top 32 and really solidify itself as a top-tier deck. I think one of the reasons that it fell short at Columbus was that players oversided. I know going back, I sided Gemini Imps, Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, IDD Crows. I had a lot of cards to combat Grapha and dark-based strategies, looking back at Columbus specifically. As players started to cut those from their side deck, usually due to the fact that Dark World fell short at Columbus, obviously that made Game 2 and 3 a little bit easier. In addition to that, for me, Dark World is at their ceiling when they just play Dark World Dealings and Card Destruction. Those are both pivotal cards because they're turbo cards that generate advantage. They churn through your deck really quickly. They dig you into the combo pieces like Mind Crush and Drag Down to the Grave, or Drag Down plus Mind Crush, and at the time, if we're talking about Columbus, Trap Dust Shoot. And cutting those cards, which a lot of players did in order to compensate for the mirror match, lowered the ceiling of the deck. I feel like after Columbus, Dark World players decided, you know what, we need to go to the ceiling. Our deck didn't perform at the top as it would have if we played these cards at Columbus. Let's ignore the reality of playing maybe 1 or 2 mirror matches and just jam triple Dark World Dealings and Card Destruction in our decks. And that's, to me, when Dark World really took off, when it really started to play towards its ceiling and not try and compensate for the mirror match. As time progressed and 2011 turned into 2012 with some of the limitations to the Tengu Plan engine, Dark World was still a top-tier deck looking at the summer 2012. Unfortunately for Dark World, though, it had a few things going against it. One is the fact that Inzektor was easily a top-tier deck, and it's not that Inzektor themselves were a bad matchup, but players often sided Shadow Imprisoning Mirror Game 2 and 3 for the Inzektor match, which did happen to cross over and affect Dark World as well. So that was going against it. In addition to that, Dino-Rabbit was one of the top-tier decks, and Dino-Rabbit itself is actually not a bad matchup. Graph is a great beat stick. The problem is when players popularized Macrocosmos, now all of a sudden they had a turn 1, game 1 floodgate that they could flip and cause you to instantly concede unless you have access to that 1 copy of Heavy Storm. The third thing going against Dark World was that without hand traps, you were particularly susceptible to the wind-up loop, especially if you were going second and they opened with a combo. Hunter doesn't discard, it sends, so it's not going to trigger any of the Dark World effects. Even with that all being said, even with those 3 pretty big things going against it, it was still a deck that you needed to take into consideration. There were multiple on the top of Long Beach, of course, it won Long Beach. There were multiple at the top throughout the format, both at YCSs in the United States and in Europe, and it's definitely within that realm of maybe the top 6 or 7 decks at the time. For me, the Dark World deck that I loved the most was the Turbo Dark World deck that really tried to combine the power of Mind Crush and Drag Down to the Grave, trying to go through the deck as fast as possible to disrupt not only what your opponent's doing on the field with Grapha Destruction, but in their hands specifically, combining really well with Dotu card, but also deck Devastation Virus, which means for me, we're going to jam triple Upstart, triple Drag Down, triple Dark World Dealings, Card Destruction, right? We don't care about the mirror match. We're going to play Allure of Darkness, and we're trying to overwhelm the opponent with all this draw power turn 1 so that we can see their hand, disrupt their hand, and then beat them in the following turns when they have very few outs to what we've got established. And this deck, although it might not seem like it, is a deck that can just avalanche card advantage. If you think about Tour Guide during this format, Tour Guide was obviously a pivotal card, both in the ability to bring Rescue Rabbit from the banished pile, both from the ability to combine with Blackluster Soldier and Chaos Monsters and some of the Agent, or rather some of the Chaos Dragon-based decks. It obviously had a slot in virtually every deck that went into the extra deck with rank 3s, but in this deck specifically, one Tour Guide can obviously summon another from the deck, or Brow, that's a key, Brow can obviously bounce to hand for Grapha. So one tour guide could result in Grapha on board, Brow in hand. But if you have a banished Dark World, it gets even crazier, and that's easy to do with Allure and Gates. One tour guide could turn into Levier that brings back a Dark World from the banished pile, bounces to hand for Grapha, and now you have a follow-up. You have Levier, which could itself be a follow-up, and you have Grapha on the field. So to me, this deck could just push tons of card advantage out of nowhere, and although players might look at the deck and think, it's a hand destruction deck, it is that too, but it also had that ability to grind and generate tons of card advantage, which made it a really cool deck. I never had the courage of playing this deck at a YCS, though I was very close a couple of times. I actually had it built at YCS Chicago, the one that Aaron Noel won. He beat me in the top 32 in a Dino Rabbit mirror match. But I actually had this particular deck built, and I was playtesting it the night before, and I just didn't have the courage to pull the trigger. Maybe in retrospect I should have, who knows? I lost in the top 32. Obviously, I would have wanted to win, but I always wanted to play this deck, but I never had the courage, because to me, I thought, macro is popular in the main, Shadow Imprisoning from the side can be tough. You have no outs to the wind-up Hunter loop. But the deck was still playable. The deck still had some reasonable success around the edges, and I think it's definitely a deck that's worth profiling. If you want to play Dark World a little bit earlier in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, you could go back to Columbus in and around that time period that we've talked about with Agents and TG Stun or TG Beatdown / Tengu Plan, and play basically this exact same deck, but you get to play Trap Dushu, which is another hand disruption card, and then you can cut the second Torrential Tribute. Honestly, that's the framework of the deck that I'm basing this off of. So what you are about to see is for March 2012, which is the Summer Nationals format. You could tweak this deck ever so slightly, go back in time before the release of Windups, before Inzectors, and play this at Columbus with minor tweaks, and actually get access to a card that helps the deck quite a bit, which is Trap Dushu, especially because you're playing double Mind Crush and Drag now. But nevertheless, we're going to take our first deep dive look at Dark World Turbo, based a lot on Claudio's deck from YCS Brighton, tweaked a little bit in the side deck for what you would anticipate at the 2012 Nationals. All right, we'll start the deck profile off with Grapha. Grapha is obviously the boss monster in this deck. It is such a huge card advantage engine in and of itself. Even when your opponent deals with it through something like DD Crow, it's probably a card that's already generated card advantage because you destroyed something upon discard. Maybe you've already bounced it from the graveyard back to the field by bouncing a Dark World on your field to the hand, which is just a free special summon from the graveyard. Boosts all the way up to 3,000 attack when Gates is on the field. It really is the critical card in this deck, one of the most powerful cards in terms of boss monsters at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. In order to support our triple Grapha, we have 3 copies of Brow and then 3 copies of Snow. These are easily the best Dark World monsters in terms of consistently having cards in your hand. Brow lets you get the draw. Snow lets you search any Dark World card. Snow also has the ability of searching an additional copy of Snow. Sometimes when this deck was trying to grind you out, you were able to use Gates of the Dark World on 3 consecutive turns, discarding Snow, because the first Snow searched the second then of course searched the third, and then eventually that third one might search something like Brow. So you get to have those double draws multiple turns in a row, build up card advantage, and eventually grind your opponent out. They were, in addition to just being fantastic discards, also had other functionality in terms of how this deck worked. Brow is a target for Tour Guide, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and then Snow boosted up above the deck devastation threshold when Gates of the Dark World is on the field. 2,000 attack is also no joke against matchups like Dino Rabbit, Hero Beat, where 1,900 is usually a pretty important attack threshold when we're talking about Alias, Thunder King, and Sabersaur. So Snow and Brow, unbelievable cards. Beyond just the fact that they had great discard effects, they actually rounded out some of the weaknesses of this deck and really filled a couple roles beyond just the fact that they had good discard effects. Other than that, we have 3 copies of Tour Guide. This was obviously a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Tour Guide was in quite a few different decks. Inzector has often played Tour Guide. Windups obviously played Tour Guide. Dino Rabbit, this deck. The fact that you could search Brow is just absolutely insane. Most decks, you'd have to go Tour Guide in either Sangin or another copy of Tour Guide. This deck actually can resolve all 3 Tour Guides by searching out all 3 copies of Brow over the course of the game. Tour Guide, summoning Brow, and then bouncing Brow to the hand for Grapha. It's just a huge power play. In addition to that, the ability to go into Levier and special summon Dark World monsters that had been banished through either Gates or Allure was also incredible, because then all of a sudden one Tour Guide ends with Levier on the field, and then the Dark World monster that was banished gets bounced in your hand to special summon Grapha. So one normal summon of Tour Guide ends with Grapha on field, Levier on field with an attachment for the following turn, and then whatever the Dark World happened to be that was in the banish pile back to your hand. It just makes Tour Guide absolutely insane, having access to cards like Levier, which fits so well into what this deck was trying to do. The last monster, a little bit debatable. The real debate is, do you play Beige or do you play Silva? And they both have merit. They are both totally reasonable inclusions. If you play beige, it's more likely that you'll be able to go into double Grapha, because you can go normal beige, bounce it to hand with Grapha, discard beige through Gates, and then special summon beige from the graveyard, and then bounce it to hand to summon a second Grapha, which is obviously really good. One of the reasons why I've elected to put Silva here is I think Silva applies more pressure against matchups like Dino Rabbit. Even without the attack threshold boost, Silva's attack at 23 can be difficult for the deck to deal with. It gets over all of the monsters within their normal main deck. Of course, once they access the extra deck, they have to go into something like Lagia in order to deal with Silva. And honestly, I think Dolka is better against this deck. So as a result of that, I think having Silva is actually a pretty useful piece against that particular matchup. In addition to that, when you're playing against that deck, if you allow the game to go really far and really long, they'll eventually draw into Macrocosmos if they're maining it. And if you were able to stick Silva early and then particularly boost it up to 26 through Gates, you could use that as a win condition in a game that might be pretty difficult to win. Beige is okay because it boosts up to 1900 when Gates is on the field, but obviously at that point they can still crash monsters like Sabersaur, so it's not quite as good. There's definitely a debate there. In addition to that, Silva is a dark over 2000 for deck devastation virus. I could understand why you go with beige over Silva. I've elected to go with Silva. That was the card that I would have used if I played this deck back in 2012, but totally reasonable to include beige instead. But usually that last spot was for either beige or Silva. The other, default cards here, the 3, 3, 3, and 3, those first 12 cards are pretty staple in all Dark World decks. From that point on, to me, that last card could be either beige or Silva. It really kind of depends on what you think the format's going to look like, and if you really worry about having to attack over normal monsters out of Dino Rabbit. In terms of the spells, we have 3 copies of Dark World Dealings. So Dark World Dealings is easily one of the most powerful Dark World cards. And I think one of the reasons why Dark World struggled initially, particularly right upon release, was the reality of playing against the mirror match scared a lot of people from running Dark World Dealings. Right? If you trigger any of your opponent's second Dark World effects because you run a card like this, it can end up being really detrimental. It actually was a reason why some people didn't even play this deck's most powerful card, Card Destruction. I think once people sort of conceded the likelihood of playing against the mirror match is only happening maybe once an event, if that, and actually started to include these in the main deck, it really increased the threshold and power level of this specific deck. Right? This deck, once it's starting to play these cards, can really hit its ceiling. And that's actually when this deck started to see success. So I think it's really important to run the full copy of Dark World Dealings because it is just inherently one of this deck's most powerful cards. Obviously, yeah, there is a downside where your opponent can discard some of the hand traps that are really bad against you, like Effect Veiler's not that great. It only really hits Tour Guide. Maxi can be a little bit questionable. But you get to dig through your deck. It fuels your Snow. It fuels your Brow. Anytime you get those discard effects like Grapha, like Silva, it's just huge card advantage in the long run. And having a card like Dark World Dealings allows you to consistently churn through your deck because you have a bunch of other draw cards in your deck, like, for example, 3 copies of Upstart Goblin, which was a little bit before the time that Patrick Hoban popularized 3 Upstarts in just about everything. But this deck did try to take advantage of the fact that a 37-card deck plus a bunch of other draw power allowed you to get through the deck quickly. Gates of the Dark World is another card that lets you turn through your deck quickly. It is not a once per turn effect, though. If you did have a second copy, it might not necessarily be a good idea to play it, right? The games last long enough where just sitting on one and letting your opponent MST it and then playing a second one naturally could be more beneficial than just using 2 in one turn, but you do have that option. Gates of the Dark World is important because it boosts your monster's attack, which matters for deck devastation virus, as I commented on a few moments ago. In addition to that, getting over some of the thresholds out of Dino Rabbit, boosting Silva to 26 is a pretty big deal. It forces the opponent to go into something like Maystroke, which isn't exactly as powerful as some of the Lagia and Dolka options they might otherwise have. In addition to that, because you can banish cards with this every single turn, it fuels things like Leviair. I made that comment when talking about Tour Guide. When this deck gets that huge avalanche of card advantage, it's usually because it set up the banish pile and then resolved Tour Guide with Grapha in the graveyard. So Gates of the Dark World, another draw engine, fueled the banish pile, boosted your attack over some of the important thresholds. Really a pivotal card for this deck. The other draw card is Drag Down. So I think Drag Down was one of the most important cards in this deck because it allowed you to look at your opponent's hand and pinpoint their most powerful card and get rid of it. And usually you can manipulate your hand such that you're only discarding Dark World that you really want to discard. Sometimes you go first and you have Graph in your hand and it's not as good. But if you go second and you look at your opponent's hand and rip them of sort of the 1 or 2 cards in their hand and you get to discard something like Grapha and start to pop cards, that can be really advantageous. And besides the risk of triggering a Grapha without anything on the field, all of the other Dark Worlds are fantastic. There's some risk of having double Tour Guide in your hand, but even then you can just wait, right? You summon Tour Guide on 2 consecutive turns and then use drag down to the grave. In addition to that, because you have so much draw power in your deck between Dark World Dealings, Upstart Goblin, Gates, and then even some of the other cards, this card is more reliably going to resolve in a beneficial way for you. It's really one of the pivotal cards. Knowledge is such an important key to this deck, especially when you run cards like Mind Crush that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So being able to know what's in your opponent's hand and then pinpoint their best cards ended up being a huge part of how this deck tried to function. Beyond that, we have a bunch of one-ups. So Allure of Darkness is at 1, or else we'd probably run more copies. You don't obviously want to banish Grapha, but banishing all of the other Dark Worlds is fantastic because you can just bring them back with Leviair and then bounce them to hand with Grapha's effect. So 1 copy of Allure is really awesome. Foolish Burial, essentially just to send Grapha to the grave. Grapha is that powerful. We always want access to it in the graveyard. Monsterborn is insane in this deck. Yes, it's just a power card. You're not running any tuners, so you don't have access to synchros, so that might seem a little bit surprising, but the ability to just reborn any Dark World and bounce it to hand for Grapha can make Monsterborn a +1 instead of just reviving the most powerful card from the graveyard. Heavy Storm, I know this deck has Gates in it, but Heavy Storm's too powerful of a card not to run, especially in a format where Macrocosmos is in main decks. Card Destruction is an instant win. I mean, at least more often than not. The idea of playing Card Destruction, triggering 3 or 4 effects beyond just the draws, absolutely incredible. And then 1 copy of Dark Hole, which, in this deck you have Grapha, which serves as your removal piece, but we are worried about Lagia, Dolka, we are worried about the Dino Rabbit matchup, so it's useful to have a card like Dark Hole in addition to Grapha. But those are our spells. Moving on to the trap lineup. So Reckless Greed is at 3 at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, so we are definitely going to play a full 3 Reckless Greeds. One of the things about running all this draw power with the spells is that you dig into copies of Reckless Greed, and then you can resolve 2 or 3 copies of Reckless Greed in 1 turn, hopefully pushing you so far ahead that you end up winning. And the idea of playing Reckless Greed and then combining it with Card Destruction is absolutely insane, right? Card Destruction just inherently is that -1. The second you start to add Dark World effects, though, now all of a sudden you're breaking even, you're going +1. And if you can trigger Card Destruction with multiple cards in your hand beyond what you would naturally have, because you put together 2 or 3 copies of Reckless Greed, it's really hard to lose when you're playing Card Destruction and it's guarding 6, 7, 8 cards, because in addition to refueling your hand, you're triggering 3 or 4 Dark World effects. So triple Reckless Greed. 2 copies of Torrential Tribute is one of this deck's only defensive cards. This deck's not going to run Mirror Force. This deck's not going to run Deep Prison, Bottomless Trapple, Solemn Warning. So in terms of defense, Torrential Tribute is the inclusion. This deck functions well with this because it gets into wind-up Zen mains frequently through Tour Guide. You don't even necessarily mind using this with Graph on the field because you can just revive it on the next turn. So Torrential Tribute worked a little bit better than some of the other inclusions. Then we have 2 copies of Mind Crush. Again, one of this deck's win conditions is to just rid your opponent of their best cards. Through Dark World Dealings, Gates, Upstart Goblin, all of those draw cards, you end up drawing a bunch, and then through either Deck Devastation Virus or Drag Down to the Grave, you get to see your opponent's hand and then discard their best cards. Absolutely critical piece. In some really dire situations, you can actually use Mind Crush to call a card you know is not going to be in your opponent's hand and then discard a card through its effect and trigger a Dark World. That is something to take into consideration. It's very rare that that actually happens. But if you're sitting there with a dead Silva, you could theoretically get it into the graveyard through the discard and then revive it to the field through Silva's effect because you ended up calling, Exodia or something. Then, as I mentioned a couple times, we're playing a single copy of Deck Devastation Virus. I could see you bump Deck Devi up to 2. It wasn't great in every matchup, though. It was fantastic, though, against decks like Inzectors, Windups. It hit the small monsters out of the Rabbit deck, so it had some utility there. So it had some flexibility. I don't like having multiple cards like Deck Devi, though, because obviously drawing multiples isn't great. Before this format, one of the cards that you were able to run was Dust Shoot. That was banned heading into March 2012. Obviously, Dust Shoot's good in every deck, but Dust Shoot was fantastic in this deck just because you're playing Mind Crush and Drag Down. I could understand bumping up Deck Devi just to increase the likelihood of being able to see your opponent's hand with Mind Crush, but with triple Drag Down, I didn't personally feel like that was much of a problem. And then we have 1 copy of Solemn Judgment, which might seem a little bit out of place, but if you're looking at your opponent's hand through Drag Down and then using cards like Mind Crush, Solemn Judgment ends up serving a similar role to a 3rd Mind Crush because you know exactly what to Solemn Judgment and when to Solemn Judgment because you know all of your opponent's hand. So it works sort of as a 3rd copy of Mind Crush. But that is our trap lineup. In terms of our extra deck, I've elected not to play any of the possible tuners, like sometimes people play Fabled, sometimes people play other cards. I think just sticking to what I just showed you and sticking exclusively to Exceed monsters in the extra deck is probably the way to go. So for me, this extra deck is going to have a bunch of cards that might not necessarily come up in the course of an event, but it's not a bad idea to have as many options as possible. We'll start with first the rank 3s, which to me is the most common because you have access to Tour Guide and you can actually resolve 3 Tour Guides. We have Leviathan, Giga Brilliant, 2 Leviers. That to me is critical. Some people only played 1. To me, you definitely want to play 2. You are fueling that banish pile through Allure and through Gates, so I definitely want to have access to 2. You're playing 3 Tour Guides. You might even want to bump this up to 3, to be brutally honest. When you can go Tour Guide, bring back a Dark World, bounce it to hand, summon Grapha, it feels amazing. It is a huge momentum swing, so you definitely want to have as many copies of Levier as reasonable. Submersive Carrier Shark is an interesting one. You do technically fuel your banished pile through Allure and Gates. You could do some chip burn damage through this. Obviously, it's not something that's going to come up a lot, but you never know. You can deal, 400, 500, 600 points of burn damage and use that to win. We have Tempo, which to me is one of the best Exceed monsters during this format. It worked really well against things like Acid Golem, baited out negations on things like Lagia. And then we have 1 copy of Acid Golem. So those are our rank 3s. Plus, to me, one of the more important ones, which is Zen Mains. And I do, in fact, have 2 copies. And I do think you need 2 copies. Zen Mains slowed the game down. It was removal. It was your main deck out to Macrocosmos, right? If you just crash into their Sabersaurus or one of their other monsters and then trigger this effect, you get to detach and destroy Macrocosmos. If people are playing Macro in the main deck, which was, of course, the case in Macro Rabbit, you want some main deck outs beyond just 1 copy of Heavy Storm. Zen Mains was your out. Zen Mains was a fantastic way of combating decks like Hero Beat. Hero Beats have almost no good out to Zen Mains. It's actually how I lost in the top 4 of Long Beach. Hero Beat is a great deck, but if your opponent's not going to crash their Zen Mains into your monsters and allow you to use Deep Prison, it's almost impossible to get rid of Zen Mains in an advantageous way. You end up having to use 2 or 3 cards just to deal with this. So Zen Mains, critical piece, really fantastic way of slowing the game down, and actually did a fantastic job against some of the common stun or beatdown decks like Dino Rabbit and Hero Beat. And then for the rank 4s, this deck has room, so you can play Utopia and Utopia Ray. You never know, you could come up with a way where Utopia Ray ends up winning you the game. So you never know, we might as well play it. This deck has plenty of space. Papilioperative is another one. Or Papilio Operative, I always pronounce this card in weird ways. I always get made fun of how I pronounce this, but this deck doesn't necessarily need to out Spirit Reaper as much as some other decks, but you never know where the situation of putting something into attack mode matters, so might as well include it. There's tons of space. Maestro could come up. It's a pretty awesome effect in the sense that the ability to Book of Moon something can come up, and it can be difficult to deal with, right? Again, to summon this, we need to be using double Snow or Snow plus Monster Reborn, so there are maybe situations where that's not necessarily warranted, but it can slow the game down similar to Zen Main, so this deck has the space, might as well include it. Same thing with Roach. You could play against a Chaos Dragon deck. Again, there's some Exceed monsters here that are not likely to come out, but you never know. You might as well have the options. The last one is Erratic Dragon. You could theoretically put double Grapha on the field and actually feel the need to go into it and pop some cards. The Graphas are basically floaters as long as you have Dark World cards in your hand to revive it on the next turn. So going into this actually isn't that unreasonable with double Grapha. So I definitely think you want at least 1 rank 8, and this is definitely the best one. This was released in the middle of the format. Galactic Overload was a release sort of in the middle of the format, but it was definitely legal for Nationals, and as I mentioned in the intro, we're looking at a deck that would have been playable at Nationals, so we are in fact going to include this. In terms of what our side deck's going to look like, well, what are we going to play against? We could definitely play against Heroes. We could definitely play against Insectors. That was probably the most popular deck. We could definitely play against Chaos Dragons, right? We're looking at Nationals, so we are looking at a point in time where Chaos Dragons were legal. Chaos Dragons really sort of debuted at YCS Dallas during this format. You wouldn't have seen these at YCS Long Beach, but you would have seen them going forward. Then, of course, there's windups with Hunter. Unfortunately, Hunter sends, not discard, so he's not going to be triggering your Dark World effects, but that is definitely a top-tier playable deck. Of course, we have Dino Rabbit. And then the last one's the Mirror Match, which is kind of a weird one because at this point, like I mentioned, players got to a point where they started just to play Dark World Dealings and not care about playing against the Mirror Match game 1, which kind of makes it an awkward situation. Whoever gets to go first, if they open card destruction or Dark World Dealings, the likelihood of them just losing the game. So we do need to have some type of side deck plan because we need to take those cards out. So what's our side deck going to look like? So for me, this deck, as you probably noticed, didn't have any hand traps. And I think that was actually a pretty big advantage of this deck, was not playing the hand traps. Hand traps conflict with things like drag down, but going second against windups, you're going to feel powerless. So I would actually side deck triple Maxi, especially against windups. And that's really the only matchup that I would use this. I feel like you can handle all of the other matchups. Playing against windups, I want at least something to try and combat what they're trying to do. So I think Maxi is the best hand trap for that purpose. one of the strategies after that. So the rest of the cards transition the Dark World deck from this sort of turbo, reckless greed-based deck with drag downs into a more controlling-based, slow-paced strategy. So a card like Spirit Reaper slows the game down. It can be pretty difficult for Dino Rabbit decks to deal with Spirit Reaper, and it does just that. It slows the game down. It's a Dark for a lure. It's a level 3 that functions well with what this deck is trying to do. It does exactly what you intend on doing in games 2 and 3, which is stall out a little bit. You anticipate your opponent's going to have Macro Cosmos. You anticipate your opponent's going to have DD Crows. You anticipate your opponent's going to have Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, and you can't just try and play the Dark World engine the same way in games 2 and 3. So you needed to really transition away from turboing through your deck and expecting all of these discards to resolve. So instead, we're going to play some slow-paced cards like Spirit Reaper, which still fits well into what we're trying to do. Morphing Jar is another card that, right, I think it's actually a little slow game 1, which sounds crazy because it's such a powerful card. But if we anticipate games 2 and 3 to be more slow-paced, right, we have some floodgates in here. Morphing Jar, if it ever resolves, can obviously switch the game into your favor because you can discard a bunch of Dark Worlds and get a bunch of card advantage. So we are going to put a copy of Morphing Jar in our side deck. One copy of Darkarm Dragon, it's limited to 1. It is such a powerful card inherently, but with cards like Drag Down, it conflicts. But we're signing out cards like Drag Down going into game 2 and 3 because we don't anticipate just that turn 1, 3 or 4 draw cards, set everything up, and beat you with Mind Crush. We expect the game to be prolonged. So we're going to have cards like Morphing Jar and Darkarm Dragon that plan for those longer games that are just so inherently powerful on their own. We need outs too. Macro Cosmos and even cards like D-Fissure. So we are going to play 3 copies of MST. In addition to that, Shadow Imprisoning Mirror can be a problem. So we really do need to max out on outs to those floodgates. So we are going to play 3 copies of MST. We are going to play a couple copies of Dimensional Prison, again, just to slow the game down. It's a good card against a bunch of strategies, whether that's Heroes, whether that's Dino Rabbit. Maybe in retrospect, this could be something like Dust Tornado, but Deep Prism is actually pretty common in a lot of these side decks. Then we have our own floodgates. We have 2 copies of Goes in Match. We are unaffected by Goes in Match unless we go into our extra deck, and we do need something to combat some of the strategies that this card really strongly matches up well against, like Dino Rabbit and Windups, right? You flip Goes in Match, and now your opponent can't do any of their combos. They can't go into their extra deck. So Goes in Match really fit well into what this deck was trying to do in games 2 and 3, which is slow down those 2 strategies. And then 1 copy of Dark Smog. Dark Smog was probably a little bit better against the plant decks going back a format prior, but this card was actually still reasonable against some of these other strategies, right? If you always get rid of their Hornet in the graveyard, that's pretty good, though granted they can equip Hornet from hand, so it's not a perfect out. I wouldn't even necessarily recommend side decking it in against that matchup, but it's good against the Mirror Match. We don't otherwise have anything really great against the Mirror Match, and we do need to side out quite a few cards between, realistically, the drag downs, the Dark World dealings, and the card destruction. So, we have the MSTs, Deep Prison's not too bad, but something like Dark Smog gives us an out against that deck. And Dark Smog is, as it always has been, a consistent stream of discard that allows you to discard on your opponent's turn, right? Gates of the Dark World is one thing, but you can only use that on your turn. Dark Smog is a card that you can activate on your opponent's turn, and then discard something like Grapha as a interruption, discard something like Silva to block an attack. So gave you some flexibility there. I could understand cutting this maybe for something like Dust Tornado, which is also good in the Mirror Match, but I think enough players are playing Dark Smog that it is representative to showcase a side deck with Dark Smog as well. But as you can see, looking at this extra deck side, rather the side deck as a whole, we are taking out a lot of the turbo cards like Drag Down, maybe even to a certain extent cards like Mind Crush, depending on exactly how many cards we take out. And we are side decking in a much slower paced strategy where we're not trying to just turbo out with a bunch of spells on turn 1. We anticipate a much longer game. We anticipate running up against Floodgates, running against DD Crow, and having to counteract that with a totally different strategy, which is exactly what the side deck tries to do. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.